Welcome to the Ada Lovelace Day podcast. I'm Sue Charman Anderson, and this month we're talking about building chemical sensors with an iPhone and duct tape with Dr. Raychelle Burks. And we'll be exploring the story of electrical engineer Margaret Partridge with the head of the IET Library and Archives, Anne Locker. We'll also take a look at some of the challenges involved in telling the stories of inventions and discoveries made by women. So this month I am very happy to welcome Dr. Raychelle Burks, who is an assistant professor of chemistry at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. Hi Raychelle.
Hello.
Great to have you on the show. So you're a chemist. We haven't had very many chemists on, so I'm excited about that. Which sort of area of chemistry do you focus on?
I am an analytical chemist, and I like to tell people that we're like the detectives of chemistry. So we don't make things, we don't make chemicals for the most part, but we find them, and we find them in lots of other things. So the joke, my students always roll their eyes when I say this, but people say, oh, I could find a needle in a haystack, or it's like finding a needle in a haystack. And that should actually be pretty easy because those are very different things, right? A needle and a haystack. But in analytical chemistry, we are usually trying to find a very particular needle in a stack of needles to the exclusion of all other needles, right? And so that's what I like to think that we do. So I'm also interested mostly in detecting things and monitoring things that I would say analytes of forensic interest. And so that would be, your illegal things, your controlled things. And we have a lot of those, right? So we've got, people often think about drugs, but there's also explosives and chemical and biological, radiological weapons. Nuclear weapons are, they contain controlled substances. And so I help design methods and systems to detect and monitor those things. But oftentimes too, that it's a pretty big reach actually, because a lot of the precursors or breakdown products are lots of different things. And so we end up having a lot of lap with, say, environmental, because sometimes you can use different pesticides or herbicides to make even more interesting compounds, fairly innocuous things, but a couple steps later and you've got something really interesting again, but probably also highly illegal. So there's, a lot of things that we're looking at that kind of are a couple steps forward or a couple steps back from the nefarious things. And so we're trying to design ways to monitor those things. And so there's the real high-tech methods, instruments, and I love those. I'm an analytical chemist, so of course it's like, can we use some high-powered separation? Let's throw an HPLC at it, and so all of these things. But then on the other end is the need for low-tech detection methods, and that's really in the recent years is where I've spent most of my time, is developing low-tech methods, because in times of crisis or in areas where power consumption might be limited, or you just have to have field portability, people would often say, oh, well, that's kind of in an area that's disadvantaged. And that's not necessarily true. If you're in a national, emergency, which could be a weather-related event, right? So like a Katrina or some type of disaster which hits regionally and kind of knocks out power, you still need to do certain levels of analysis. You might really need to do them if you're talking about judging water quality or trying to make very immediate assessments. And so the types of tests I work on are what are called presumptive assays, and they're kind of more for triage, where they're kind of going to give you, hey, this indicates the presence of something we should be worried about, so let's flag it and we can make a real quick decision. And in my lab, we're focused on making those tests even more robust, because sometimes there's false positives and there can be false negatives. We want to minimize that. And so we come up with new ways to do that.
So it seems that there's quite a broad number of chemicals that you might be testing for, but you're trying to keep the tests very simple and portable, and I presume also cheap.
Yes. I mean, I'm always, especially I think being an analytical chemist and then previously working in a crime lab, I have a real appreciation for budget limitations. I like to tell people that when I worked in the crime lab, our total yearly budget was about half of the budget per episode of CSI Miami. Right? So that gives you a scale, right, of what you have to work with, and yet you must meet the demands of the community. Budget is always a thing. And so kind of how my collaborators, and I started this work in my postdoc advisor, Dr. Andrea Holmes, is thinking that, no one color test is going to be kind of a panacea. But what we can do is instead of just having one, we do an array, making it an array of kind of a testing strip, which we use those things a lot. So anybody who owns a pool or any student who's ever used pH paper kind of has an idea of the types of tests and the medium that we're working in. Sometimes we use very old classic tests, but we are modernizing the phase they're in. So instead of being all liquid, we're out of liquid, we're into solids because they're just easier to work with. Instead of being a single test, we have an array of 10 instead of just using the human eye. I don't know about you, but sometimes you'll say, oh, I really, I love, my favorite color is blue. And then the person brings you turquoise and you're like, I said blue. Why is this turquoise? And so sometimes with color tests, right, the problem is that people have different definitions of what they call red or pink or blue or green. And so to take out that ambiguity, we started doing image analysis. So graphic artists know this, right? If you don't leave it up to chance. You don't just say, I want it blue. You give them exact, say, RGB color code, or you give them a Pantone color number. And so we started doing that, which has really taken the guesswork out. But on the good side, it doesn't add a tremendous amount of new tech that's going to be expensive, because a lot of just software that's freely available and computation that's very, very cheap, such as your mobile phone, will allow you to do that type of analysis without adding that additional cost. So we're working within those confines of, how much is it going to cost per unit? Would the, average local person, local like laboratory or local entity that would be in charge of monitoring this, is this something that we would be able to afford? So I'm an applied scientist. And so definitely as the applied scientist, it would be like, what's cost per unit? How long is it going to take? And in forensic science, a lot of times the initial kind of assessments are not done by scientists. So, and anyone who's traveled recently knows what I mean, because TSA is doing some type of testing, right? Anyone who's ever gotten advanced screening, swabs on the hand and they put it in a doodad and then there's a boop, boop, boop. And they're like, you're clear. And you're like, thanks. There's more involved in that. But you have to have analysis that you can train someone to do, but that is not like solid state NMR. It can't be at that level. And so the good thing about these types of tests is that they're easy to use, they're straightforward, and very easy to train someone to do, and we are training large volumes of undergraduates to kind of get the trainability data. Is you can instruct and get good efficacy in 10 or 15 minutes. That's what we work on.
It's funny that you should mention the sort of airport screening, because a couple of months ago, one of our Invention of the Month segments was actually about Dr. Betty Harris and her test for TATB.
Awesome.
So that seems to be very sort of similar to the kind of work that you're doing, is it building on her work?
Well, so I did. It's funny because in graduate school, I developed a chemiluminescence assay for TATP. It's a real big area of research, wet chemical assays and instrumental techniques. We all kind of build on each other and meet the environment, that we're in. So we're trying to do low to no tech solutions. And obviously something that's like, if you're trying to monitor a train station or an airport, gosh, you've got real different concerns than if you're I'm going to be going out to, say, a clandestine laboratory in the middle of nowhere. Your concerns should be different. Your testing methods and equipment would be different. In a big transportation center, you're probably doing a lot of passive monitoring in addition to active monitoring. So that whole process also influences the type of test you do, which is great, right? Like we don't just have one test for TATP. We have tests depending on what environment, what weather conditions. Are you actively monitoring, or you just want to monitor something in the air over a unit time? Like we've got all of this stuff and every kind of parameter covered. It's that kind of interwoven blanket coverage gives you the total analytical angle, but also a level of security.
So what do you think is the biggest challenge with this kind of work? Because, I mean, it does, to me, sound quite complex, and also, you have budgetary limitations. But what do you think is most challenging?
Our biggest challenge actually related to images. We're doing a lot of image analysis, which is really powerful, and there's tons of folks in different applications working on this. But, the biggest challenge is just getting a good image, a reproducible, reliable image. And if you're in the field, the first thing we ask ourselves is, okay, so we're going to be in conditions that we can or cannot control lighting. Are you in natural light? Is it cloudy? Are you going to be in the glare of like spotlights? All of that. So what we have done is we're focusing on using mobile phones, which are fairly available worldwide. The fastest growing markets in cell phones are, south of the equator. And so these are kind of uniform technologies. So you've got basically our two ones that we're looking at are Android-based systems, right, and iOS-based systems. Phone-wise, for cell phones, the great news and the fun part of my job and what my students also like is we get to use as analytical, we're a bit engineering in that we kind of come up with crazy schemes to accomplish something sometimes. And the good news with this is that, again, graphic artists and photographers have really done us a solid, because if anybody's really consciously studying and troubleshooting, reproducibility of images and getting true color information, it would be those folks. And they're also coming up with portable equipment because they're filming and they're taking images in all kinds of environments. So one of the things my lab also does is just test out different recording systems, whether still or moving images, to see what can we control, what kind of, portable light box. And we've got a couple of those that we're testing. And because the image is now your primary data source and you have to have confidence in it. So for us, our biggest challenge right now is not the chemistry, it's taking a good image, which as chemists, we're just laughing that it's like, you never can tell what the biggest challenge is going to be. And for some people that have just huge data sets, right, the challenge is data storage. The challenge isn't so much bench work. The challenge might be, how do we visualize the data? And so sometimes the biggest challenges are just not the ones we expect. They're not how did the chemistry work? It's more like, how do I take this image? And that's kind of it's one of those surreal moments. But for us right now, that's our number one challenge as a research team, because I work with collaborators on that. But every piece has got to work at an optimum level.
So it sounds like you have to do quite a bit of cross-discipline collaboration and thinking, because you've got the technology and the chemistry, and then, as you say, the sort of the issues around color balance, which, as anyone who's tried to take a photograph on a mobile phone knows is easier said than done.
There's one project that I'm working on that's kicking into high gear shortly. It's called, we came up with DIVAs, we're so proud of it, Digital Imaging Visualization Analysis for Science. And it's a big collaboration. The three PIs, there's myself, I'm a chemist, and I'm really interested in color analysis, like colorimetry via image analysis. Then there's my colleague, Dr. Tessa Durham Brooks. She is a plant biologist. She's really interested in shapes, morphology, looking at root growth. So very different than what I do. She's not really interested in color very much, although there is some green density she does when she looks at certain types of leaves, but really it's root growth and kind of shape. And then there's our colleague, Mark, who is a computer scientist and does facial recognition. The unifying thing, however, is that we all have to have high quality images that are true, to the environment or the system that we're testing so that our data has integrity. And so we came together and wrote this grant, and our students are working together because even though we work on very different projects, we have the same problem. And so because of the cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary approach, Mark's really bringing in the strengths of programming and computation, and I'm bringing in kind of the colorimetric kind of focus, and then Tessa's bringing in the morphological biological focus. And that's where we're really excited. We always want to come, outside the box, but how can you come up with outside the box thinking if you're in the box, right? And so by having these different folks with really different projects but a common problem, we're coming up with really fun solutions that none of the rest of the teams as individuals would have thought of, because sometimes you're just too in your box sometimes.
And it sounds to me that you have, in terms of application, you obviously have the very specific applications to forensics and that of the work you're doing with the identification of different compounds. But then there's this broader project as well that sounds like it would have very varied applications.
We're going to be doing a boot camp here soon. And, different projects are coming up all the time, because you tell people, your colleagues and stuff, the kind of work you're doing, and then you realize, wait, you use images too for a completely different reason? Or, and so there was a photographer that has been collecting and taking the same image of the same kind of geographical location, for decades now. And so for them, they're kind of looking at it from an artistic angle, right? And then for us as data scientists, it was funny because the biologist is like, ooh, the structure of the environment and how plant growth has changed. And I'm like, ooh, we could track color over that time. So there's lots to do there, because this approach, instead of it being a common project, it's more of, we have a common problem. And there are, like spokes of a wheel. We have a central problem, which is images, and then retrieving the data, and then handling the data. But these images can be coming from anywhere, and the information can be applied to anything. And that's the really exciting part, is to see what's the new angle here from either direction. What's the new application? Or that just blows your mind every day or every week. And the students are finding a lot of stuff because their mind, like ours, has been open to, instead of looking at common project, common problem. And so we're seeing a lot of cool conversations going on.
That's a really interesting way to put it as well, an interesting way to view it, because we're almost trained, I think, to think of the project first, rather than where very, very different projects have a similar problem.
Absolutely. Me too. I mean, it's funny because how this whole grant even got kicked off is, my colleague in biology was downstairs, and she was having a problem with a very particular scanner that she was using to monitor something else, and I was using it to do a completely other thing. And she just heard, rumor, right, from a third colleague. I'm like, so it turns out that, I had no idea, because I'm not a biologist, and sometimes when you have a certain level of training, you become so much tunnel vision. I had no idea that plant biologists, and they have there's this whole eye biology thing. There's this whole plant image community. They've got this wealth of years and years of using images to do all kinds of advanced analysis. And then with that comes all the computation. And I got an opportunity after having literally a hallway conversation. She was going to a conference within a couple of weeks that was going to be all plant people. But again, the image questions and the instrumentation was the same. So she got me into that conference. That's kind of how it started, was we stumbled across this common problem. And since then, we've really been trying to reach out beyond the scope. And I think within a year of that, I had put together a symposium at the American Chemical Society on image analysis. And again, there in the room, it was a day and a half of talks all over the map. Medical imaging, again, looking at the development of whole cells. And that's definitely not what I do. But in listening to the methodology and again, the challenges, came back again and again, collecting good images with integrity and then processing the data. And I learned so much just from, each one is kind of doing it in their own way. They've all got their tips and their tricks. And I think that approach, at least my exposure to it, is really blown my mind.
Excellent. So it sounds to me that one of the qualities that you bring to your work is this ability to sort of think outside the box and identify common problems. What other qualities do you think the people who work in your field have that you have that makes you successful?
I think sometimes analytical folks, at least in my mind, they tend to be really fun in the MacGyver aspect. Everything has a budget constraint when you're talking about instruments, but I have seen some real ingenuity when you're talking about someone who's going to design a system. And I'm sure with synthetic colleagues, it's the same type of imagination. But for me, it's in instruments, right? I told we needed to come up with a temporary photo booth for our scanner. And I was like, good, get that duct tape and that cardboard box, and we are going to make this work. I learned that in grad school, too. Some of the things that, you buy that are like really like, ooh, advanced, this can do all these things. And then, your advisor or older graduate students like, yeah, we're just going to saw this one thing in half and it'll save us like $1,000. Like, so I really appreciate that because I'm essentially a very applied, practical person. But I also, I grew up with MacGyver, and I like the whole aspect of, here's a roll of electrical tape, a ream of paper, and a pencil. Make it work. My students love that too because it's almost like scientific craft time. And that's kind of the fun nature of it. And also, you're building it. It's not just something you're using. Even if it's a temporary photo booth of a cardboard box, there's an ownership there that you contributed something meaningful and valuable that I definitely think that, especially for trainees, is really essential for motivation and for perseverance. And I just like it too, because you're like, that's my cardboard box. No.
It does sound a little bit like we need to introduce a standard first year module called MacGyver 101.
Yeah, and it's funny because the lab that my students liked the most in instrumental was a great one. That's a lot of folks do it. It's building a spectrophotometer using a smartphone. And you buy a couple of ingredients off of Amazon, and you give a bit of a write-up, and there's so much creativity that they get to show, and they get to be full-on MacGyver engineers and making this thing work. And they had the most fun, and I had the most fun. I mean, we just saw some great stuff.
You're making me really feel like I need a change of career, because it sounds like a huge amount of fun.
We do have a lot, and it's funny because in my office, I'm just looking around going, man, I got a lot. Like, just, okay, I've got several rolls of this type of tape, and we've got the things that we put together. It is fun. And the funny thing is, it's like sometimes you do have the budget to splash out, and we could buy the fancier version, but you're like, no, I kind of like our duct tape microscope slide / cardboard, whatever.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for MacGyvering with us today.
Thank you.
It's been a great conversation, and I'm going to go and get some duct tape and make stuff.
Yes. Mission accomplished.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Raychelle.
Thank you.
Thanks to Raychelle for talking to us about her work this month. You can find out more about her on her blog at 37.scientopia.org. That's 37 in words, not numbers. And you can follow her on Twitter at Dr. Rubidium. That's at Dr. Rubidium. And I'm sure some of the chemists out there have already twigged the link between Raychelle's blog and her Twitter name. Rubidium has, of course, an atomic number of 37. As usual, we have these links and more on our blog. Our podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support of ARM, our exclusive semiconductor industry sponsor. You can find out more about ARM's energy-efficient microprocessor technology on their website at arm.com, and you can follow them on Twitter at ARM Holdings. If you'd like to join ARM as a co-sponsor of our podcast, then please email me at sue, S-U-W, at findingada.com. Now it's time for Discovery of the Month. At the beginning of the year, when I decided to introduce this segment to the podcast, I honestly had no idea what I was letting myself in for. I shouldn't have been surprised to discover that we know as little about women's discoveries and inventions as we do about women in STEM in general. At first glance, the internet appears to be littered with lists of inventions by women, but most of them are unsourced, lack detail, and after reading a few I realised they're really pretty repetitive. When I started digging into details, I realised that for many of the women mentioned, there's either not enough information available online to develop even a short narrative, or the assertion that so-and-so invented such and such turns out to be just wrong. So, for example, there's no evidence that Tabitha Babbitt invented the circular saw in 1812, though her name appears on many lists. In other cases, claims are simplified to the point of error. Margaret Knight didn't invent the rotary engine, but she did invent and patent a type of rotary engine, the sleeve valve engine. She also patented several components for or improvements to rotary engines. Knight is also a good example of how little we know about women inventors. She was prolific with 22 patents to her name, but at least some of her patents were assigned to the Knight-Davidson Motor Company. So the full extent and impact of her work, which may run to more than 80 inventions, is unknown, at least until some real research is done. So why are women's inventions so poorly covered? In part it's because women's inventions were frequently ignored. Look at how Hedy Lamarr's invention of frequency hopping was rejected by the US Navy, or how long it took Rear Admiral Grace Hopper's software compiler to gain traction. The more I read about women's inventions, the more I see this story of a woman inventing something only to be told that the world has no use for it. That position seems to only change when the patent expires, as happened to both Lamarr and Mary Anderson, who invented the mechanical windscreen wiper and whose story I'll tell next month. Another problem is a lack of documentation. We've seen with Margaret Knight that when people are working for a company, the details of who invented what get lost or obscured, often because no one thought it was important to credit women for their work. Worse, women's personal documentation is often deliberately destroyed after their death. Relatives keen to expunge from the record what they considered to be unladylike behaviours are more than willing to dispose of letters and papers. Many of Ada Lovelace's letters were destroyed after her death, for example. And even when documentation wasn't deliberately destroyed, it frequently just wasn't preserved, ending up in the bin as if just rubbish. So we have almost none of Mary Anning's letters, and rarely do we hear about her life in her own words. As attitudes towards women's achievements in STEM change, I hope that we'll see more people doing real research into these stories, piecing together the jigsaws to give us a more complete picture of women's achievements. There is a real need for librarians, archivists and historians to focus more attention on these hidden women. After all, we can't celebrate women in STEM if we don't know their stories.
So this month I'm really excited to be talking to Anne Locker, who is the head of the IET Library and Archive. Hi Anne.
Hello.
As an archivist and a librarian, you must actually know quite a lot about different women in engineering and technology. So who have you chosen to talk to us about today?
Well, today I'd very much like to talk to you about Margaret Partridge, the electrical engineer who worked in Devon in the 20th century.
She's a figure that I don't know anything about, and I was going to look her up online, and there's not much out there about her.
No, there isn't, and that's one of the reasons that I've been doing a bit of work on her, and have also submitted an entry for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, so that people can find out a little bit more about her and about what she did. She was a working engineer, and she did some really interesting things, but she was doing it as a professional engineer, as many engineers would have done at that time.
And what sort of era are we talking about?
Well, she graduated from university in 1914. She studied mathematics at Bedford College, and she first went into engineering during the First World War, first as an apprentice and then in a munitions firm in London.
Did a lot of women get into the sort of more engineering side of things during the First World War?
Yes, absolutely. So many of the men who were working in those technical roles were, of course, off fighting, and so those roles needed to be filled. So the UK realised that they had an untapped kind of pool of talent, really, which was women, and they were perfectly capable of fulfilling technical and engineering roles, in factories and elsewhere. So a lot of women who went on to become professional engineers later on between the wars started off during the First World War.
And was it common for women to continue after the war had ended, or did they kind of go back to the kitchen?
Well, the main difficulty was in 1918, on the conclusion of the war, the government passed an act which is called the Restoration of Pre-War Practices Act, which guaranteed jobs to the men coming back from the front. So those women who were working in factories actually had to resign, and they had to leave. And in fact, some factories wanted to keep them on, and they were prevented from the unions for doing so because the jobs had to remain open for people coming back from the front. So it was very difficult for women to carry on in that professional engineering sphere after 1918. So one of the things that happened in 1918, which was a huge help for women engineers, was the formation of a Women's Engineering Society, which first started in 1919, and it was specifically to help women who wanted to be engineers carry on in that profession.
And so what was it that Margaret did to sort of keep herself in engineering, to continue her career?
Well, like many women at the time, she found it difficult to get employment with the larger organisations and factories. So what she did is she set up her own consulting company. And this is something that's fairly common that we find for women in this period in the 1920s. They're setting up their own businesses, they're becoming consultants, they're becoming specialists. And she set up a consulting company specifically around electricity supply in rural areas. She moved back to her family home in Devon, and she set up various companies to provide electric lighting and power both for country houses and for small villages and towns as well.
Of course, we forget that there was a time before the national grid. There was a time before ubiquitous electricity.
Yes, so at this point, individual people, if they owned a large enough house, or towns and villages, could decide to get electricity in, and so they would ask for a company to contract for that electricity supply, and that company would then they would generate electricity and they would wire up the individual houses, and that's what Margaret and her company did.
It feels a little bit like there's a sort of parallel between the work that she was doing then and the work that people do in trying to get villages onto high-speed broadband.
Yes, absolutely, and I suspect some of the same challenges. I mean, the infrastructure wasn't really there. She was setting up all that herself, and she also had to deal with people who perhaps weren't 100% keen on either electricity coming at all, or the company being managed by a woman. So she did write in the Women's Engineering Society journal about some of the challenges she faced. She did say, though, in some cases her being a woman was an advantage because people didn't forget her in a hurry. So she quite enjoyed that. But she had a lot of debates, especially when she started wiring up the houses. So people wanted electricity, but they didn't want wires to come across their gardens. They didn't want anything to be disrupted. So there was one instance where one of her engineers was arrested because he tried to string a wire across the end of somebody's garden. The landowner objected and kept cutting it down. So they went to actually have a chat with them, and it all got a bit fraught, and the police were called. All these kind of interesting things for her to manage, as well as the technical issues of actually wiring a village.
Yeah, and it must have been quite cutting edge at the time. All of electricity's been around a while, but people just aren't used to this technology. They must have had some fairly technical hurdles to get over.
Yes, absolutely, and a lot of it was about promotion as well. So another thing she did, she was involved with an organisation called the Electrical Association for Women, and that was specifically about encouraging women in the home to take in electricity and to use electrical appliances to lighten their workload. I mean, one of their slogans was emancipation from drudgery, which is fantastic. And Margaret was a local representative for the EAW. And in the 1920s, she also put in an exhibition of domestic electricity equipment in Exeter to try and persuade people that electricity would be a good thing and it would make their lives better and easier.
Because there was a lot of misunderstanding about electricity and a lot of sort of fear. There's a lot of moral panic about if we have electric lights in the home, then people will be able to look in the windows and all that kind of sort of problem.
Yes, absolutely, and the danger as well. Although it must be said that the alternative gas lighting wasn't without risk, and there were some interesting debates between the gas companies and the electric companies that which one was more likely to kill you. So said, well, you could be gas, yes, but you could be blown up. Or you could be electrocuted. So a lot of expectations to get over. She found generally, though, that people were positive. And in one of her letters to Caroline Hazlitt, who was the secretary of the Women's Engineering Society and a prominent figure in engineering in her own right, she talked about having lit her first village, which was terribly exciting, and having run the electricity to individual houses, and everybody would invite their neighbours around to see the light, and they'd be amazed at this new technology, and then complain that their own houses weren't wired up yet, and why wasn't she moving more quickly?
And so she had this consultancy. How long did she do that for?
Pretty much through to the beginning of the Second World War, when she became a technical officer for the Ministry of Labour and advising on what she did in the First World War, which was how to use women in munitions and other areas of a war effort. There were a few ups and downs there. One of the problems she faced was she employed engineering apprentices, and unusually for her time she employed women as apprentices, but she expected her employees to pretty much work all hours, which is what she did. I mean, she talked about working late at night and being the only person in the power station, and the power going off and being the only person who could fix it. And one of her apprentices was unfortunately discovered working late at night in a power station on her own, and that was in contravention of the International Labour Organization rules on women and children working at night. So women weren't supposed to work at night on their own. So she was unfortunately got into quite a bit of trouble about that. But that case was taken up by the Women's Engineering Society, and it led to a revision of the rules which were changed to exclude women working in supervisory roles. So if a woman was working as a supervisor, she was allowed to be on her own at night.
It seems so odd now to think about that kind of restriction, but definitely another era. And so how did her sort of career progress? Because the Second World War, interrupted a lot of businesses and people's lives who were so dramatically affected by it. So what was the impact on her?
After the Second World War, she pretty much retired, but she kept up her interests, and she became very much involved in the local Women's Institute and with other of the local areas. And in fact, the village where she lives still remembers the fact that when the village hall was wired for electricity, Margaret got together the WI to wire it themselves, much to the consternation of some of the men in the village who didn't think that the women should be doing the wiring. But she trained them all up and did it, and it was a success.
And she was very keen on supporting other women and training other women in technical skills.
Yes, absolutely. So Margaret Partridge took on women apprentices, as I mentioned earlier, and actually her second apprentice was a young lady by the name of Beatrice Shilling, who went on to be a famous engineer in her own right, working on aeronautical engines at Farnborough. So and it was Beatrice or Tilly Shilling who was actually the apprentice who was discovered working late at night. So not only did she take her on, and she was a school leaver, so she took her on with no real practical engineering experience at all, trained her up in all areas of not only electric lighting but also gas engineering. But she was also encouraged by Margaret and her business partner Margaret Rowbotham to study engineering, and they helped her find funding to go to the University of Manchester to study engineering. So that really set her off in her very successful engineering career.
And I think this is something that you see in people like Dame Stevie Shirley, who trained a lot of women in early computer programming, and her initial employment force was all women.
Yes.
And there's a great tradition of women helping women in STEM that I think we sometimes forget about.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's all about the networks, especially in that period, and organisations like the Women's Engineering Society and WES, and also the friendships that women formed themselves were hugely important. I mean, for Margaret Partridge, many of her early companies were supported in terms of shareholders by the women who had also supported women's engineering societies, so people like Lady Shelley Rolls, who were putting their money where their mouth was and actually funding some of what we'd now call startups, I suppose, where women engineers were trying to get into the engineering sphere, and they were happy to help in any way they could and support that in any way they were able.
Yeah, and it's so phenomenally important to women's careers and the expansion of businesses, because it's, access to capital is a major part of starting any new business.
Yes, absolutely. But also providing advice. I mean, Margaret was a brilliant correspondent. Her letters are numerous and very, very funny. But she also wrote some really good articles specifically for the Woman Engineer, which is a journal of the Women's Engineering Society, which is now available online as well, if anybody would actually like to have a look at the originals. But she talks about setting up her own company, she talks about electric lighting in country districts. I mean, she talks about starting a business, and there's a long list of things you should have, like the impudence of a small monkey, to actually go into business, and some of the difficulties that she faced. But she always writes about it in a very light-hearted way, with the aim of encouraging other women to just have a go and just to get on and do it.
And I think that is got to be the same advice now. Have the impudence of a small monkey.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, thank you so much for talking to us, Anne. It's been really fascinating.
Thank you.
Thanks to Anne for telling us about Margaret Partridge. If you'd like to find out more about Anne or the IET, then take a look at our blog. Thanks again to our sponsor, ARM, for their ongoing support. And thanks also to our editor, Andrew Marks. Don't forget you can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play and Stitcher. And if you like what you hear, please rate, review and share our podcast with your friends. Next month, we'll be talking about life as a tech reporter for the BBC with Zoe Kleinman. And we'll be chatting to Dr. Paul Coxon from the University of Cambridge about the fascinating work of metallurgist Constance Tipper. So thank you for listening and see you next month.